Sexual Mentorship and Feminist Resistance in 18th-Century French Literature. Literature in 18th-century France was crucial in shaping social and political discourses surrounding women's roles in an ever-shifting French revolutionary society. Lisa Jane Graham argues that discussions about reading in 18th-century France permeated nearly every domain of public discourse. She notes that, quote, doctors, philosophes, and moralists embraced reading as an instrument of education and progress, yet reading entailed risks. Throughout the 18th century, the promotion of reading always included warnings about abuse. Where critics blamed novels for moral corruption, fans defended them for providing moral instruction, end quote. These types of warnings demonstrate a desire in the 18th century amongst people in positions of social and political power to control dominant discourses being circulated through the increasingly popular practice of reading. I posit in this presentation that the warnings against reading certain fictional texts demonstrates the potential for these fictions to inspire resistance to dominant social discourses. Focusing on the promotion of and resistance to the dominant 18th century notion of feminine virtue, I will discuss how woman-to-woman sexual mentorship in the 1774 novel La Belle Allemande resists patriarchal notions of feminine virtue and domesticity common in 18th century fictional publications. I argue that the persuasive power of literature in 18th century France could serve, on one hand, to perpetuate oppressive patriarchal discourses at the same time as it can provide a space of resistance to them. Enlightenment authors such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Félicité de Genlis promoted and popularized through their fictional publications the notion of feminine virtue. In his educational treatise Émile, Rousseau presents feminine virtue through the character Sophie, the ideal wife described as passive and submissive to her husband, whose role is purely domestic. Félicité de Genlis published a similar didactic fiction titled Adèle et Théodore, which depicts a young girl's virtuous education overseen by her mother and focuses on teaching self-control, renunciation of passions, and maternal sacrifice. Fictional publications such as these help to popularize the notion of feminine virtue, and the fictional women that they portray are normally financially dependent on their husbands, are taught to be ashamed of their sexual desires, and their social identities are inextricably tied to their marriage and their maternity. The popularity of the idea of feminine virtue in literature perpetuated patriarchal control of women's bodily autonomy as well as their social and professional opportunities. If literature can create, promote, and maintain these kinds of oppressive discourses, I argue that it can also subvert and resist them. In La Belle Allemande, we can see this kind of resistance taking place through the life story of the main character, Thérèse. Like Adèle in Genlis's pedagogical fiction, Thérèse's education is overseen by her mother, who mentors her in the art of courtesanry, or elite prostitution. At the beginning of the novel, Thérèse offers thanks to her mother, declaring, quote, I owe all my virtues and all the glory that I currently enjoy to the care of my mother for my education, end quote. Thérèse describes both her and her mother's distaste for the institution of marriage, expressing that her mother was, quote, a victim of the obscurity in which she lived, and was obligated to dishonor her charms through a monstrous alliance with a baker in his 60s, end quote. Thérèse is here referencing her mother's marriage to her father, which, according to her, was a betrayal not only to her mother's beauty, but also restricted her mother's personal freedoms in the pursuit of her passions. Once Thérèse reaches her teenage years, her mother begins mentoring her in the art of courtesan seduction. After her first encounters with suitors, we discover that Thérèse experiences pleasure during these encounters, one of which is described in passionate detail here. Thérèse's mother teaches her how to commodify her enjoyment of sex so that Thérèse can be financially and sexually free from the control of a husband. Thérèse learns not only how to seduce men and sell her charms, but that this field of work is an art form that must be mastered to achieve success. A courtesan is not a low-grade prostitute, but a member of an elite class of women on the sexual market. The artistry of courtesans depicted in the novel is an 18th century example of what Tanya Augsburg describes as a feminist ars erotica, or erotic art. Augsburg defines a feminist ars erotica as, quote, a range of aesthetic sexual expression that has positive, educational, and activist aims. Thérèse is a character who represents a feminist ars erotica as she successfully learns how to become a courtesan through a woman-led sexual mentorship. Furthermore, we can consider that the novel itself is a publication of feminist ars erotica, presenting a positive depiction of a strong female character in control of her sexuality, her finances, and her social standing without relying on a husband or children to give her life meaning. This is overtly demonstrated at the end of the novel when Thérèse offers advice to the wife of one of her suitors who, though he's paid her, is in serious debt. Thérèse gives the wife some of her money and indicates that she's far too beautiful to suffer the debts of her husband, and that she could easily find men to pay off those debts, suggesting that courtesanry could be an escape from her situation. By the end of the novel, Thérèse has become the mentor not only to the wife of her suitor, but to the readers themselves. The values of courtesanry depicted in La Belle Allemande stand in opposition to the prevalent and dominant notion of feminine virtue common in fictions of this era. Bret and Vière's novel utilizes the generative and persuasive power of fiction to offer a different type of virtue for women based on sexual and financial liberty in a patriarchal 18th century French society.